This is Howard Gobstein. I'm Executive Vice President of APLU, the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this webinar on the seminal request for proposals. Before we get started, David, second slide, please. Before we get started, I'd like to very briefly review some norms or guides that we propose for facilitating the participation of all of you. We've got, my count right now is 55 people. So as you have, please don't use your video. We're also limited in obviously bandwidth, but also how many people we could show. So we decided not to use video at all, except for the presentation itself. Please mute your mic unless you are called upon and you're talking. And if you have questions, please use the chat feature usually at the bottom, where there's a bubble there that you can hit to type in your question. And our colleague Mary Laskowski will make sure that she keeps a queue of the questions, and then we'll get to them either during the presentation if they're a question of specificity to a slide, or after the presentation when we're going to leave some time for Q&A, as you can see, perhaps at least 15 minutes. We are going to record, or we are recording this presentation. We're going to post it to the APLU website, the Seminal website. We're also going to record and keep track of all the questions that are put into the chat, as I mentioned a little earlier in preview to this presentation. We'll use that to respond more fully if we need to. We probably will come up with some questions that will prompt us also to update further our FAQs on the website. So next slide, please. So I'd like to first review the agenda for this call. We're going to be talking, of course, about what Seminal is, the research team, the research goals, excuse me, what's active learning in mathematics. We'll talk about the request for proposals, giving an overview, who should apply, the expected elements of the proposed work, budget options, how we're going to review the proposals, and then, of course, your questions and answers. I'd like to, before I go on further, I'd like to ensure that all of those on the call sort of recognize or understand who's involved in this. And then I'm going to turn this over to David after I do this. So first, Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities is a membership organization, primarily of the leadership of your institutions. We have some 237 members. We've got over a dozen university systems. We deal very much with presidents and provosts and other leaders of your institutions. And increasingly, we've been mounting initiatives related to improving education, and particularly improving science and mathematics STEM education. So this seminal project is one of special interest to us, particularly given the foundational role of mathematics to all STEM majors. And we're particularly excited to have the opportunity to try to marry the opportunities of engagement of institutional leadership with all of the dedicated expertise of you as faculty members and those who are training and teaching and educating students. And hopefully together, we're going to be able to not only further imbue active learning in classrooms, but we're going to be able to change our institutions so that we can sustain the changes that we want to make. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of Seminal. As you'll see, Seminal, you probably all know, student engagement in mathematics through an institutional network for active learning. There are 3 core institutions, faculty from University of Colorado Boulder, University of Nebraska Lincoln, and San Diego State University. You see right in the middle there the primary research question, conditions, strategies, interventions, and actions at departmental classroom levels, contributing to the initiation, implementation, and sustainability of active learning, the undergraduate calculus sequence. Now, phase one was our first year, which was essentially last year, and we did case studies, both of these 3 institutions and of 3 other institutions that we selected from the wonderful study, the Progress Through Calculus study that we're very closely allied with. Now we're starting our phase 2, which is to select 9 additional partners to sort of augment our core institutions. So with 12 institutions, we're going to try to form a leadership cadre, and our focus, our objective is not only to transform these 12 institutions, but to move much further and to try to establish the opportunity for a far more significant scaling of the changes across mathematics in this country. I might note that the 3 institutions, Boulder, Nebraska, and San Diego State, perhaps like some of the rest of you, have been engaged in integrating active learning into their classrooms for a good number of years, and several years under the auspices of the Mathematics Teacher Education Partnership at APLU, which sort of fostered the beginning and is the sort of the parent for Seminal. With that, let me turn this over to David Webb, and David, as I do so, I would invite you to introduce yourself as well. I see David is...
I am muted.
There.
That was such a wonderful introduction. I'm going to do it all over again. So this is David Webb from University of Colorado, and delighted to be here this afternoon with you and to share aspects of this request for proposals for our phase 2 of Seminal. So since active learning is central to what we're trying to study and support here, we thought it would be good to articulate at least our perspectives on active learning design principles. And based on our synthesis of research, we've identified the following design principles that are characteristic of active learning in undergraduate math classrooms. First, when possible, tasks or activities are included as part of instruction that promotes sense-making, student engagement, or self-assessment of progress with mathematical goals. So there's something about the nature of particular activities that are included in instruction, not all the time necessarily, but integrated into instruction should include at least some opportunities for student-to-student interaction. It doesn't mean that needs to happen across the entire class, but certainly there should be some opportunities for that. And this is in addition to other modes of instruction like whole class discussion, individual work. So there's increased opportunities for communication and peer feedback. And then also with respect to instructional decisions, instruction should be more responsive to students' contributions and questions. So there are opportunities for instructors to assess students during instruction. There should be some opportunities for formative assessment practices to have a greater place. So these are, there could be others that could be added to this list, but within the research team, we've identified these across a number of studies and meta studies of active learning in undergraduate mathematics and STEM education. So considering how these design principles already exist in pre-calculus through calculus 2 courses or not, and ways active learning can be further integrated in instructional activities, that's part of your consideration. You're going to make an assessment of where we are now with respect to these design principles and where do we want to go to further achieve these goals. So in the phase 1 portion, I'll be rather brief here since this has already passed, but just to give you a sense of what was done. This, as mentioned by Howard, this research project is organized into 2 phases, and in phase 1, we completed retrospective case studies of 6 institutions, the one that are listed there, and these are institutions that have made some progress with infusing active learning in the P2C2 sequence. This was designed to get a better sense of department and institutional conditions that are likely to promote and sustain active learning in pre-calculus through calculus 2 courses. I know that you're more interested in phase 2, but we certainly thought it would be worth mentioning also the data that was collected as part of phase 1, including survey data from faculty and students and interviews of key personnel. So some aspects of that will be included in the phase 2 commitments, and that will be mentioned in just a moment. So with phase 2, this brings us to phase 2, where we seek to fund 9 math departments to initiate or make greater progress with implementing active learning in pre-calculus through calculus 2 courses. Some of you have mentioned, and from some earlier questions, you've asked about courses that come prior to pre-calculus or courses that come after pre-calculus. I mean, that's fine if it's part of an overall mission to mention those courses, but the core piece of work should focus on pre-calculus through calculus 2. I do want to mention that the website, the submission website, is now open, and APLU also has a dedicated SEMINAL website that includes details about requests for proposals. We'll also go to that a little bit later in this webinar. Want to highlight there is a range of funding levels. Could be anywhere from $50,000 to just over $100,000 for the period. And the funding level really depends on local need and arguments made for how your particular budget items will spur further integration of active learning over the funding period and beyond. Even though course releases, summer effort, learning assistance, and travel are mentioned here, you may not be interested or need funding for learning assistance. That doesn't have to be part of your program. These are just examples of things that could be included that others have talked about including. So we just mentioned them here as options. So the budget requests are really entirely dependent on local needs and how these might fit with institutional commitments. I think at this point, I do want to go to the APLU website just so you can see where this is. The link is given below. You can also just do a Google search there. But let me make a jump there real quick. And I'll kind of move this screen over in just a moment as finds there. Howard, can you see this screen okay?
Yes, there you go.
Okay, so this is the SEMINAL set of pages. Of course, you see the webinar details here. With this link, you can see the view for call for proposals. Some of you have already been there. But I did want to point out, if you go there, there's actually a couple links. We try to make sure this is prominent. If you click the view the request for proposals here, you will get a PDF that has 6 pages of detail about the request for proposals. So if you haven't been there yet, you should pull down this PDF, this 6-page PDF that lists all of the elements. We're going to highlight aspects of this, but I did want to point out this has all been included on the APLU SEMINAL website. Okay, so I'll go back to the slide deck. So who should apply? And before we get into the details of the proposal requirements, we wanted to first address this particular question. So if you are a 4-year college or university, if you're a department within that context, and you're a math department that has a graduate program in mathematics, either master's level or doctorate level, those are really the basic qualifications. We realize there are outstanding institutions that might not fit these qualifications that are doing some of this work, but when we frame the study, we outline these characteristics in our proposal to NSF. Some other reasonable requirements certainly include a readiness to transform 1 or more pre-calculus through calculus 2 courses. We don't, if you're at a place now where you're starting to look at opportunities to integrate active learning, we don't expect you to do this in all courses in a period of 2 years. So you have to be strategic and mindful of what's possible with respect to the local context. You should also know that we're seeking to award funding to a variety of institutions, including those who could, going forward, be strong advocates for changing instruction in these introductory math courses. In terms of institutional readiness, this should not be a solo effort. It shouldn't be just one faculty member who has some great ideas of how to do this in the course that they teach. There should be at least several faculty involved in one way or another, And by saying that, we recognize that you may not have the entire math department on board or committed to this, but certainly cognizant faculty or faculty who are involved in the work in the targeted courses should be involved. The budget justification and or letter of support should indicate at least some commitment from department or campus leadership. And with respect to participating and contributing to this networked improvement community, or we call it a NIC, there should be at least some commitment to attending an annual mini conference and virtual meetings, certainly as schedules permit. It's expected that you will participate. It's expected as a requirement you will participate in the annual mini conference, and there should be a willingness to contribute to this networked improvement community. That is, to at least connect some program improvement data and share progress and challenges that are experienced as you continue to transform the targeted course or courses.
David, there's a quick clarification.
Sure.
Question.
Okay, let me go back there. All right, go ahead and ask. Yep.
It's in the chat. Since we are on the quarter system, our single variable calculus sequence is 3 courses. So I assume our Calc 3 would be part of this grant. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, you could certainly see Calculus 3 as being included in your overall strategy. And if a year-long experience in calculus includes Calculus 3, yeah, certainly just mention that. If you're targeting all 3 of those courses, then that's part of your plan. If you're initially going to target Calculus 1 and roll up to Calculus 2 the following year, it really depends on the strategy. You can certainly mention prerequisite or subsequent courses as part of your overall plan. Yes. So now we're getting to specific elements of the proposal. So, and this is a maximum of 6 pages. So this is where this part 1, the goals and plan, is where you will develop your overall plan and commitments to specific work. So really, what's the core of the strategy here? What courses are you planning to target here? What's the overall plan over several years? And as mentioned earlier, there's an expected commitment to the active learning network, so at least making that explicit in the proposal and not leaving it up to us to assume that you will do that just because you're submitting a proposal. There should be a commitment to at least some data collection where you will monitor progress of students. So this could be, it could include instructor and or student surveys. There is institutional data likely available that looks at trends of DFAIL withdrawal rates within the targeted course or courses, and maybe looking at even course-to-course persistence trends of those students who take pre-calculus, how many go on to take calculus 1 and so forth. Just so, what do you propose to include as part of your progress monitoring efforts? So that should be included in the goals and plan here. And then beyond the funding period, what are the strategies you intend to engage with to continue this work, to continue this infusion of active learning beyond the funding period? So at this point, I'm going to hand off the presentation to Alan Donsig at University of Nebraska.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to talk about the next 2 parts of the proposal. The first part is department context and readiness. And this is something that depends very much on your departmental context. So it's not that this is a checklist, you have to cover every component of this. It's rather, the intent is to give us a sense of, what is the surrounding context for your work. And we expect that funding a variety of proposals, as David has said, some people will have some components and others will have others. There isn't one ideal model which we're trying to fit everybody into. So which components that you need to talk about depend on your situation. So what we would imagine is that you would talk about, why is this a good time for doing this kind of work, particular events recently in terms of hires, changes in the department, what have you, that make the work timely. I think it's fair to say that institutional transformation is hard, and while our money is important, there also needs to be department and possibly campus commitments or engagement in the work as well. So what's happening at the departmental level? As David has said, you don't expect all of the faculty to be on board, but some discussion of who is on board and perhaps plans for growth to get more people on board, so that we have enough to sustain the program. Ideally, depending on the size of the institution and the structure of the program, it probably talking to client disciplines may be relevant. And if that's something that's ongoing, how does that work, and how do you plan to make sure that the engineers are happy when you change a math course or whatever may be relevant to your institution? Another item that's valuable is to talk about potential obstacles and challenges. And this, I think this takes a little bit of explanation, because it's not just what could go wrong with our proposal, but also that you've thought about these issues, that you're aware of them, and you have some sense of not necessarily how you're going to solve them all, but at least these things are coming. Our experience, I think, has certainly been that these changes are iterative, and so one tries something initially and learns from that. Oh dear, it seems from the chat that there's some audio problems. I'm going to trust that it's not widespread unless there's a host of things. Okay, I'm sorry, but I'll ignore that for now. And okay, thank you, David. So finally, in the last part of E is how can the Seminole community help? We're imagining that the departments that are selected would be involved in a community here, and these other the three lead institutions have some experience with this, so it's possible that we can contribute something to overcoming obstacles and challenges. If your institution or the department is involved in local or national efforts, please tell us about those. And if you've done stuff recently that's relevant to that, of course, we would like to hear about it. So that's sort of the departmental context, 4 pages maximum. And then the second component on the next slide is the course details. And so for each of the targeted courses, and if initially you're only dealing with one course, say you're only dealing with Calculus 1, then 2 pages. If you're tackling all 3 courses, which would seem very ambitious, then, okay, I'll leave it, you can do the math. So this is a description of the course, the format, what kind of students are taking the course, how is the course structured, are you using active learning now? And it could be that you're using some and you want to improve it, or you don't have any and you're looking to get it started. It depends on the context, who is teaching the course. A particularly relevant issue is if it's taught if it runs in multiple sections, how are those sections coordinated, and what kind of what aspects are common and what's left to instructor discretion. Course-specific challenges or problems. How do you do professional development for this course, and what changes? I mean, have you made recently to the course? Has the course changed in the last few years, or has there been some change in the way the typical students that come to the course, or something like this? I should add that these last few items could very well be discussed earlier in the proposal, and there's no need to repeat the same thing here if you've already discussed them. But the goal, if you have things to say about them one way or another, we would like to have these issues covered at some point in the proposal. So I think that summarizes these issues, and I believe David is taking over.
Correct.
So I will stop there and hand it over to David.
So as Alan mentioned, there's a couple of questions related to the overlap between Part 1, Part 2, and even to some extent Part 3. So the question about this is, how should we handle the overlap? Certainly, if you find a better place in Part 1 to articulate the details, you don't need to feel like you need to address every bullet in Part 2. You can even, if you want, just refer back to what was previously mentioned in Part 1. So yeah, there is some framing that's going to happen in Part 1. How much detail that's provided in the storyline there in terms of strategy and targeted courses and such, you decide how to further elaborate on elements that should be on Part 2 and Part 3. But in Part 3, another question that came up was, can this be kind of in a bulleted or table format? It doesn't necessarily have to be in a narrative if that's not the best way to communicate this. You can organize in a way that that allows you to best communicate what's happening across these elements. There was another related question in terms of I'm going to give this back to Alan briefly, but there was a question about in Part 3, what do you mean by specific challenge?
I would like to say, I mean, I think that's certainly a reasonable topic to discuss if those are issues. But I was thinking, I believe that the question refers primarily to things like, you know, if you're thinking of the goals of the course in terms of preparing students for the next course or to be ready to do something, you know, are the engineers complaining that the students are not successful, or is there a pressure between various client departments about what material is covered in the course? But I was thinking partly of, you know, is it achieving its learning outcomes? Are student success rates what you would want them to be? From the point of view of the math department, is this a course that everybody likes or not? Or is there some, you know, I think, let me risk answering one. There's another two questions which came up, and one question asked about curricular changes that may introduce content particularly suited to active learning, and I think the answer to that has to be yes. Certainly, that was our experience at Nebraska, was that adjusting the curriculum was an important part of our course changes. So hopefully David will agree with me, but that's my take.
Yeah, I agree.
And another question is about data collection, and having already begun to do it, you know, to what extent will there be attempts to coordinate and normalize data collection across institutions? I think to have comparable data in order to answer our research questions, we need to make some effort to coordinate and normalize that data. So yes, we would want to do that. Exactly how to do it depends on the context of the institutions, and so there would have to be a conversation about that post-award. I don't think we would stand it. Obviously, people would have their sort of internal data set which fits what they need to do, and then hopefully a relatively straightforward, you know, some kind of automated processing could take care of the changes if there have to be any. I mean, DFW rates seem to be relatively standard, but we would like to make sure that they're comparable.
Right. Just to add to Alan, I think Alan covered most of that in terms of data collection and what type of instruments are being used or expect to be used. We wanted to leave this a bit open because we know some institutions already are engaged in progress improvement data collection efforts. And so if you already have something in place that's been approved by the institution, you have trend data on that, I mean, by all means, don't feel like you need to switch to something that some other institutions involved in this effort are currently using. If you're at a loss to figure out which surveys to use or how you're going to build that in over time, we can certainly provide more advice and feedback on that. And so I think in response to some of these questions, we can point you to some student surveys, some faculty surveys that are in play if you don't already have some in mind or already using some. I'm going to continue to move on, just mindful of the time. I know some other questions are being posted. We're going to cycle back to those in the Q&A, but I want to make sure we address the budget issues, budget options rather, and other related elements of the proposal. So in the final two parts of the proposal, basically it's a budget with justification. As mentioned earlier, we outlined some options in terms of what could be included in the budget, but this doesn't necessarily mean every budget needs to include all of these elements. If faculty time is already something that is supported for curriculum work at the institution, and that's not needed for either summer salary or course buyout or what have you, and certainly put the resources somewhere else. Others in previous questions have asked about infrastructure and classroom design and things like that. That certainly could be included here. So anything that you see is essential to your particular strategy, that's going to be a priority in the budget here. And it's while the budget isn't certainly nothing, it's not a huge amount where you're able to do so many things that it's you really have to be strategic and prioritize here. So you pick and choose some things that are going to be relevant to your local institution. Some are going to involve graduate assistants, some are not. Some are going to involve learning assistants, some are not. Travel probably is the only thing that we expect to see in all proposals because, as mentioned in an earlier question, yes, you need to include travel to the annual mini conference in your budget. You could also include travel to other conferences if you find that relevant and want to include it in this particular budget. But so travel is probably the only line item listed here that we expect to see in all proposals, especially to the mini conference. If the next question, the follow-up question is, well, how much is that going to cost? We're going, just as you would typically budget for an annual meeting, we plan on a 2-day meeting, so that could involve involve 3 nights, but basically two days of meeting. And the location, we're going to try to keep this manageable in terms of expense. So we're not going to hold this in New York or San Francisco. It'll be a place where hotel costs are somewhat reasonable. I'll get to letters of support on a following slide, but I also wanted to present a few different options with budgets.
David?
Yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, but we've had a few questions about funding for the mini conference. We've had a few ask, do they need to budget for both years or just 1 year?
Both. Yeah, the attendance in both years at the mini conference needs to be included in your proposal. Yes, it's expected that's part of your budget. Okay, and you decide how many personnel from your project need to attend that conference. It doesn't need to be the entire team. It could be, I mean, that would be nice if that's possible, but some teams are going to be rather large, and it's certainly travel does not need to be the lion's share of the budget. Another question was, will the mini conference be associated with another mini conference? It is possible, and we have done that in the past, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. So I think you do need to at least plan on hotel costs and such for the mini conference. The only expense break you would get is if it's coupled with another conference is in the plane travel. But just it may or may not be related to another conference. Okay, let me see if there's anything else here to mention. The budget justification is also a place where you will include at least a statement about the indirect costs or any reduction in these costs based on institutional policies or commitments. There's some institutions that for curricular work have a reduced indirect cost. There's other institutions that don't. But you at least need to mention the indirect costs that will be included or not in the budget. So let me move on to some sample budgets here that'll give you an idea of what these could include. So we thought it would be useful to review some of these. I only have 3 sample budgets given the time that we've allotted to this webinar, but at least this gives you something about some example of how these budgets are rather straightforward and simple. They're not very complicated here. So, so in this particular one, some senior personnel are involved. There's some budget set aside for salary and benefits for some personnel. In this particular case, they want to fund stipends for learning assistants for multiple semesters, and they're including travel, as mentioned earlier. There's a material line item, and in this case, this particular institution requires a 50% indirect cost, so total budget of around $100,000 here. That's just one example. Another example here would be instead of learning assistants, you're going to involve a graduate assistant, and in terms of salary and benefits for part of the time to help with data collection, maybe to help with curriculum development. Again, line item here for travel. Senior personnel in this case maybe a little bit more, and indirect in this case is a little bit less, given what the local institution either is asking for or expects. And some of these indirects certainly could be negotiated. We realize different situations are going to entail different scenarios, so you decide what's included in your local budget. Related to other non-monetary costs, like if there's some contributions by the institution, I mean, that can be mentioned in the budget justification. Like, let's say the institution is going to support over the period of time a calculus coordinator or an additional partial FTE to support the work. That can be, and you don't even need to mention the exact cost of that, but that institutional support or departmental support could be mentioned in the budget justification, could also be mentioned in a letter of support. There is not necessarily a standard rate going back to the earlier budget for learning assistance. That's all local, and it's locally dependent on what you establish for stipends. These are just some examples that have been used at other institutions. And I think Wendy Smith from Nebraska is giving you some indication of what's done in Nebraska in the chat room. I'm going to go on to budget option 3. This would be kind of in the 50,000 range. So it's maybe it's targeted on a small set of sections within a particular course, but it expands out over time. Maybe there's more institutional support to do some other things, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be at the approximate 100,000 level. It could be based on the budget justification, based on other departmental or institutional supports. We need funding for this in conjunction with other things that we're already doing. So those are 3 examples of different budget options. I do want to reserve time for question and answer, so I want to get to a couple other things here. So yeah, just to reiterate again, the budget justification is a good place to mention institutional commitments which are not necessarily financial, and maybe the institution will commit to or is already committing to classroom modifications, or other assignments of personnel, other core structure commitments, those things which are, I mean, there certainly are costs associated with that, but it doesn't necessarily have to be mentioned in that way in the budget justification. But if you've got other things going on institutionally that you want to mention as part of this overall strategy, the budget justification is an appropriate place to mention that. Lastly, the letters of support or letter of support. There should be at least some letter of support from an administrator, either at the department level or the campus level, mentioning support for this strategy. And it can be even just, it doesn't have to fit the institutional commitments mentioned above that are physical or personnel-wise, but it should mention at least someone in a leadership position is cognizant of this work and is supportive of this work. Okay. One other thing, we're almost wrapped up here with the slides, so just hang on. As I mentioned, the proposal submission site is already open. You can go to, and I'm going to actually go back to the website I had earlier and go to this particular link just so you are familiar with what that looks like. So let me jump back here. So this is the APUU Seminal website. You can go to it certainly starts with the overview here. There's the call for proposals. But when you get to the link it's in several places, but here's one location for it. It says via this submission site. You should be bounced to the University of Nebraska, which has kindly set up a submission site for proposals. As you notice, it's currently open. It closes October 10th. This little info link will get you to the RFP, the PDF that was mentioned earlier. So this RFP, I think, is absolutely essential if you plan to submit a proposal, because it gives you significant detail about the expectations, some of those which were highlighted in the webinar here. But we encourage you to create an account and start the proposal process sooner than later. Certainly don't wait until the last week. Get a sense of what's there and how this is organized, so you know the pieces that need to be submitted and uploaded. So again, this can be found under the call for proposals for phase 2. In the language in the last paragraph, there is a link to the submission site. Okay, so lastly, the schedule. So certainly you're with us now. The proposals are due October 10th. We expect to have award decisions communicated with those who've submitted proposals in December. And you, in terms of budget or in terms of plan or in terms of schedule, you can expect to launch in spring semester 2018 or sometime in early 2018. Certainly there's going to be conversations that happen between APLU and your Office of Contracts and Grants to get all the T's crossed and I's dotted, but so various institutions will have start dates around early 2018. As mentioned, yes, we will have a recording of this webinar. We will have posted to the APLU Seminal website. We'll also post these set of slides. Some of you wanted to revisit those budgets and other details. Certainly, if you have specific questions, you can post those questions to the Seminal email address, seminal@aplu.org. But now we're going to open up the time, as promised, the last 15 minutes to questions and answers from the group. We have some questions that have already been posted to the chat room. So I'm going to actually go back to that link, and hopefully I can bring it up here. And there's a whole set of questions that have been asked here. So we're going to cycle back to some of these, and certainly Howard or Alan, feel free to jump in on some of these questions that were posted earlier. I'm going to try to make sure we review questions. We already talked about the quarter system. Let's see here. Yeah, every time something's posted, it jumps. So I'm going to have to hold it here. Yeah, back to Elizabeth Miller's question from earlier. Are data collection instruments such as surveys determined by individual institution? Again, if you have something that's already in play or you have something that was in process, certainly you can go forward with that and mention that in the proposal. If you're curious about other instruments, certainly send a question to that Seminal email link, and we can respond. We will also post some other information to the Seminal frequently asked questions. Let me bypass some of these. We did address the overlap and challenges and curricular changes. Let's see, hang on a sec.
Small classes?
Small classes, some of you, that's a major institutional effort to, certainly if you're not in small classes, to change to that. But I think what you're mentioning here, is a requirement to have small classes? No, you can describe efforts at doing some of this work in, how might some of this be infused with lectures in part, or how might you target maybe the once a week recitation or tutorial to do a lot of the active learning infusion. So it doesn't, no, we've all started in different contexts, different instructional contexts, whether it's large lecture or small section. So you have to kind of take an account of where you are and what's possible over the 2-year period. Let's see here. We did the standard rate for learning assistance, and also budget items that are not necessarily, that are contributed by the institution but not involving specific amounts. Do NSF rules about indirects govern how much they can be reduced? I'm going to let Howard take this one.
Yes, thank you, David. This is Howard. No, this is mostly an institutional or departmental decision as to your indirects and how you charge. We recognize indirects are real costs to the institutions, but institutions also have some leeway, and sometimes that's the way they choose to show institutional commitment or not, or there might be other ways of showing institutional commitment even if they charge their full indirect costs. But that's mostly a local level decision.
Let's see, Wendy addressed some questions related to, you don't have to include pre-calculus, you can focus on just one course. These are all locally dependent. You can, and as discussed earlier, you can include mention of college algebra. Maybe that's part of your strategy into pre-calculus, or other maybe specific courses, like one for the life sciences, Calc for Life Sciences as a targeted course as part of the overall plan. That's fine. Let's see here. So now we're getting down to some of the last questions posted. Are projects that start early 2018 preferred over those beginning? No, not necessarily. We're just mentioning I mean, oftentimes when you kind of lay out a plan and you lay out kind of a timeline of when this will take place, we just wanted to mention that early 2018 could be included in some preparation work. You don't have to have something going on in courses that spring semester. Especially if nothing has launched at that point, you find out in December. So it's basically a phase-in semester, or maybe something's already in play that's going to intensify in early 2018. Let's see here. Explaining the difference between PI and leadership team. Can there be co-PIs? Yes, absolutely. If anyone else wants to elaborate on that, Alan or Howard?
Wendy's also on the call.
And Wendy? I don't know if I addressed that completely, if you have other thoughts.
I think it's fair to say I mean, like many aspects of the proposal, set up a system that reflects the reality of how you have things structured.
I mean, you can mention everyone as team, but I think there should be a point person, though.
Yes.
That's going to be responsible for some of the initial communications with an award, with OCG and such. So you can have a PI and the rest are leadership team, or you can call them co-PIs. It's however you want to name them in terms of responsibilities. Anna asked, do you need to have a graduate program to apply to Seminal? Someone else want to pick that up?
Well, I think we said yes, you have to have a graduate program. I think there was a question about whether a graduate program in math education would qualify.
So based on how we negotiated this with NSF, at least a master's program in mathematics was the requirement. And again, as mentioned earlier, we know that there's some excellent institutions out there that may not be able to fulfill that requirement. And we would encourage those institutions not just to depart and say, well, forget this. We do have a number of institutions involved in efforts that there's other funding sources as well that we could point you to. But in terms of how we proposed this to NSF, we established that programs that could apply had to have at least a master's program in mathematics.
And I think we're also trying to be complementary to the progress through calculus. What wasn't that also the universe that they selected?
Yeah. Now, if you're an institution that does not have a graduate program in mathematics, I mean, stay connected to our network, because if there is significant demand to engage in this work, we do have a plan to go back to NSF for supplement funds. So, in other words, don't disconnect from this opportunity. Although it doesn't allow you to qualify for this particular funding round, if there is significant interest and demand from other institutions that don't fit that qualification, we are very mindful of that and are trying to be responsive. Let's see, there was...
There's a question about how detailed the project timeline needs to be.
Yes. I think it just needs to fit an overall strategy, but go ahead and certainly describe that if you, or go further with that if you'd like.
David, there's also a question on literature review.
Yeah, I saw that. It came right before that. So let's talk about timeline briefly. So maybe within that question is an issue of, well, we're not sure how the early activities are going to morph out into other efforts. Well, you can at least provide a kind of a projected 2 to 3 year plan, or 2-year plan and then beyond funding period of what you hope might happen. But we know things can change over the course of several semesters, and you're going to need to be responsive to the progress monitoring data, course adjustments that are needed. But at least at this stage, at this proposal, provide at least a sense of what you see as an overall, let's say, 2 to 3 year plan. The literature references that support elements of proposed changes, certainly if you're aware of some of those references, include those. It just allows us to know how you're situating some of the work in things that have already been discussed elsewhere. We could also include some references that we know of that we've been used to articulate what active learning is, and also to justify this work. Certainly some that just come off at the top of the head, Sandra Larson's study that was in the Journal for Research in Math Education. I think that was from 2014, and talking about shifts in student dispositions and reports of learning. The Freeman study in the National Academy's proceedings, I think also around the same year, talks about not just mathematics, but STEM education and active learning there. But we'll include maybe a few more references. Yes, you could include references in part 1, so we kind of know how your work is situated. We've got time for a few more questions here. Let's see here. Timeline, multiple sections. If a course has and by the way, even though you see the time is about to end here, if you still have questions, continue to post those. We can pick those up on the FAQ. If a course has multiple sections, do the changes need to include all sections? I mean, I have an opinion on that, but I'm going to hand this off to either Alan or possibly Wendy. You can go right ahead.
Wendy wrote a reply, which I thought was a very good one.
Yeah, the plan. Have a plan that gets you to all sections eventually, but you don't need to start there. It can be a growth over time model, and how you're going to eventually bring other sections on board.
I think there's a comment there about sustainability, that things that are done in a few sections, but not all of them, can often disappear.
Okay, let's see here. Yeah, I think that responds to the questions so far. Let's see here. Is an institutional research plan desired and or required and or desired? Institutional research plan. I mean, it certainly shows how the work that you're doing within the math department fits within the larger context of the institutional research plan. I don't know if you have room to mention all the details of that, but if something exists, certainly mention it and provide at least some information about how your specific work in this proposal fits within the overall institutional plan. At least that's how I'm interpreting what you mean by institutional research plan. Let's see here. Rachel Arnold has a question. Are there other more specific institution qualities that you're looking for in choosing new partner institutions? I mean, described as a variety of institutions that cuts a number of different ways. Alan or Howard, did you want to pick that one up?
Well, Wendy has a partial answer here saying that we were looking for variety in terms of geography, student population. I mean, we want a diverse range of institutions. I think, as Wendy says, a key component is that it's not one or two faculty changing one or two sections of a course, but a commitment to change a course. And I think the involvement of departmental leadership, or a commitment to that it's possible or likely to be sustained, that there is at least a potential to make a long-term change.
Right. The last question here, and I think we'll close with this one. If institutions are not funding during this round, will we receive feedback on our proposal? I mean, it's certainly our desire to do so, to provide feedback to anyone who submits a proposal. I think if there's possibly further questions that come up based on the decision, I mean, you know how to find us, and we can certainly engage in some conversations. There's because of our interest in having a variety of institutions involved, there may be highly qualified institutions that are not awarded because there's similar highly qualified institutions who write a strong proposal. So it may rest on that, some of those decisions. But knowing that it's difficult to put the effort into submitting a proposal and then just getting a final decision without any feedback, we'll certainly remind the research team of the interest in doing that. We want to be responsive to your initial efforts in being part of this work and contributing to this work.
Hey, David.
Yeah.
Before you sign off, I wonder for the people still on, and we still have retained most of the people. I'm noting 56 people still on. Would you be so kind as to show them the FAQs and how to reach that?
Sure. So this is back to the Seminal website. It's under APLU. And if you go to the call for proposals here, you'll see Phase 2 FAQs. And we have a growing list of questions. And certainly after this webinar, we will add additional questions and our responses to those questions. So you might want to check through here and see if this is responsive to questions you already have. And if not, certainly send us an email and we'll do our best to respond more specifically.
And please do note the email address, seminal@aplu.org. In the August doldrums, perhaps maybe it wasn't a doldrum for you, but in the August doldrums, we were a little lax in responding, but we're now checking that box several times a day. So do feel free to write to us if you have any questions or comments or concerns as you proceed.
Okay, I think that wraps it up for our webinar. Certainly, if you do have other questions, you know how to get in contact with us over email, or we're about to close up this webinar chat room. So thanks for being here. Thank you for your interest. We're thrilled that there is great interest in this work, and we hope to hear more about your efforts going forward.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye all. Have a great weekend.